thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I feel very privileged to talk to you about the sort of work I do. And I'm going to take up Kate's suggestion of just discussing more broadly my research and my approach to give you a sense of the sorts of ways I'm thinking about place and placemaking. So what I'd like to do is to present this morning some of the ideas and approaches that I'm drawing on in my recent work. And some of the images you'll see are from those projects. So there's one looking at children in the growth corridor in Melbourne and their experiences of change. Another one is looking at sustainability and connections to place in Dunbar and South Gippsland. And the third one was from a few years ago, looking at Bermagui and people's connection to place through festivals. So I want to talk about these ideas as a means to open up conversation about how we can approach this question of who is making place. Some of you will know the ideas that I've been exploring are around sound, the processes of listening and how place is constituted through sound, not necessarily as a representation of place, but is more about its experience, so the experiential aspects of being in place and feeling those sounds and hearing those sounds. In recent work, I've turned to an exploration of embodiment, emotion and effect, and I've started to explore the body as a whole, the emotions and the effects and how they play these roles in the processes of placemaking, and then how these may actually contribute to notions of social cohesion, well-being, belonging, inclusion, alienation and resilience. So what I want to do this morning is talk about and focus on two interrelated concepts for me, sound and effect. So I'll talk a little bit about how and why I see these as interconnected, and then use one particular example to demonstrate how these concepts can help us unpack the way in which place is constituted. To begin with, my understanding and conceptualisation of place draws on the work of British social scientist and geographer Doreen Massey. Massey argues that the concept of place arises out of particular moments of intersecting social relations, which she describes in terms of nets of which over time have been constructed, laid down, interacted with one another, decayed and renewed. So in this framework, places are not bounded, singular or fixed in terms of an identity or even a location, nor is the meaning of place derived from a set of essential characteristics distilled from some intrinsic nature. Rather, what Massey argues is that the particularity of any place is constructed not by placing boundaries around it and defining its identity through counterposition to others which lie beyond, but precisely through the specificity of the mix of links and interconnections to that beyond. So I think that's really interesting for me in thinking about how these places are constituted. What are we bringing to these spaces? What are we taking out of these spaces? So this also means that the meaning and identity of a place is continually negotiated. For as Massey suggests, place is a vast, intricate complexity of social processes and social interrelations, drawing on both contemporary and historical notions of that place, and I would add future aspirations perhaps for that place. So it's within this understanding of place that my work is located. So turning to the first concept, that of sound. So more than simply representing places, communities or identities, in my work I argue that sounds, everyday sounds, music, noise, are integral to place, because they mediate the emotional and affective relationships that comprise our relations in and out of place. Recent work in a number of disciplines has focused on the phenomenology of sound, yet such work has tended to emphasise the ear without acknowledging that the elements of sound, such as timbre, rhythm and tempo, have an effect on the body as a whole. Research drawing on the ideas of Deleuze and Guattari and non-representational theory has emphasised the multisensory quality of sound, which opens up the viscerality of sound in important ways. As a number of scholars have argued, sound is not merely a background to our lives. We experience sound around, in and through our bodies, so reminding us how place and people are very much intertwined because sound passes through the body and through other bodies, connecting them. So when we focus on sound, our perception of place is altered, as well as our perception of others, both human and non-human, because it demonstrates the continuity and discontinuity of our subjectivity. And this is what geographer Paul Simpson proposes is an awareness much more about a perception with. So this points to a focus on viscerality, the important role played by bodies, affect and emotion, while being mindful that human and non-human bodies and elements are always situated somewhere and entangled in wider social norms. But why sound? So for me, a focus on sound requires a focus on the processes of sound perception. And for me, what's significant is this process of listening. Because listening draws our attention to ourselves not as separate entities within a place, but is very much embedded in and through those human and non-human elements. And I use the word listening deliberately, that there are differences in terms of hearing and listening. And this is a distinction drawn by the French theorist Jean-Luc Nancy. So the practice of listening, as Nancy suggests, is an intensification and a concern, a curiosity and an anxiety. That is, there's a difference between listening, the French term écouter, which refers to an experience of sound in which we don't fully interpret what we're hearing or what we're experiencing, and hearing, which is the cognitive process of understanding and comprehension. But I want to be cautious here. I'm not distinguishing between these terms in ways that, strictly align listening with non-cognitive processes and hearing with cognitive processes. Rather, the two, listening and hearing, operate through our bodies simultaneously. So we shift between these registers, we shift between these modes. So even so, listening points to the ways we're immersed in sound and made aware of the connections we have beyond the borders of our individual bodies. And it's this awareness that's of interest to me. And that's because in this conceptual framework, listening is more aligned to the emotional, affective and bodily responses we have to our sonic environments that are felt but often evade meaning. Considering how individuals listen provides insights into the ways in which sonic knowledge forges connections to place and to others in both representational and visceral realms. And through this approach, our attention turns to our bodies and how they're enlivened or deadened through the ways sound mediates the flows of energy in between human and non-human bodies. So sound provides important cues to the affective and emotional connections and disconnections to place. And this leads to a significant connection with the concept of affect. Because a focus on affect means rethinking the capacity of bodies and what they can do. Now, the range of disciplinary accounts as to how affect operates reflects its complexity. Affects are argued to be variously biological, neurological, social and psychological. Although there's no one definitive meaning of affect, and this is often further complicated by its association with terms such as emotion, feeling or sensation, in all its guises, affect is most used in geographical literature in the Spinozian sense, as the bodily capacity to act and be acted upon. Moira Gayton's readings of Spinoza's concept of affect is a rich resource to develop ways of conceptualising who makes place, as this framework enables us to explore power, affect, joyful and sad passions, bodies, differences, responsibility and geographical imaginations. A key insight of Gayton's reading of Spinoza's work is that there needs to be a collective responsibility for the ways in which the past endures in our present practices. And she points towards the importance of social imaginaries. Those images, symbols, metaphors and representations which help construct various forms of subjectivity and which are important in who's making place. In particular, Gayton's is concerned with the often unconscious imaginaries of a specific culture. These ready-made images and symbols through which we make sense of social bodies and determine in part their value, status and treatment. So drawing on this Spinozian framework, affect then is relational. It's integral to what geographer Nigel Thrift describes as an emergent and transforming experience. Affect moves between what feminist philosopher Teresa Brennan explains as a vehicle connecting individuals to one another and the environment, connecting the mind or cognition to bodily processes. So hence my approach seeks to explore the importance of the affective relations in between the human and non-human elements of a space, as well as those in-between ideas in the body itself. So to bring this together, I want to talk about one particular example from a recent project, just to show you how I'm using these ideas. Now, the project was carried out in Dunbar, a coastal town in Scotland, in which I, along with two colleagues, Michael Gallagher and Gordon Waite, explored how individuals and communities make sense of sustainability through their everyday practices and experiences. So the method involved 3 activities. So a semi-structured interview encouraged the participant to talk about those places in his or her everyday life. As part of the interview, each participant drew a mind map of those places. And finally, each participant was invited to work with the researcher and record what we've called a sound diary. So a record of those sounds in place which were important to them, and to talk about why they're important. So the example I want to talk about is, and this is a pseudonym, is Olivia. Olivia has 2 key roles in the town of Dunbar. She works as a pupil support assistant at a secondary school, and she's also the convener of the community woodland group. Olivia's focus is on how to ensure that the younger generations can be more sustainable. Now, while this example is not strictly about an urban setting, how Olivia responds provides a really clear example of how the data I collect opens up how we might understand relations with a place and how that place is then constituted. So Olivia has a strong commitment to environmental issues and self-sufficiency, and she wants to share this with the younger members of the Dunbar community. Given her connection to the woodland groups, it was unsurprising that Loch End Woods was a significant feature in her everyday thinking. So just from one of the interviews we had, she's actually drawing her mind map of this place. She says, the woods, it's described it before, the woods is shaped like a hand, which I think is a really interesting image. There's loads of artists and crafty people that choose to live this end of the country. It's great. I think that's what helps make this community so interesting. Now, while her comments point to a personal and emotional connection to this particular site, these descriptions nonetheless retain a focus on how Olivia connects to others through the woodland. But in the field recording, when we went out to the woodlands, we see a shift in this focus. So Olivia took us on a walk through Loch End Woods, and while walking towards a circle of yew trees, we discussed an activity that she has school children participate in, one that focused on remembering ways through the woodland but without using vision. And as we moved closer to the yew circle, we started talking about the role of the body in navigating through a location and how important different senses become when you're not able to see. Now, as we're doing this, we all noted a drop in temperature and how it had become darker, and we began to talk about the yew trees and their associated superstitions. Now, the important thing in this discussion, there's quite a bit there where she's talking about the importance of a rowan tree to her, that her father planted that when she was a child, and it really meant something to her. And towards the end, she starts getting very tearful and upset, and she says, "We drove around the corner. I could hear the chainsaws. It still upsets me. I'm absolutely fine now, but there was that one thing, and I was just completely traumatised by that, you know." So she's talking about how after moving out of this house, they went back to see and visit some friends, and she heard the chainsaws and she knew her rowan tree was being cut down, and the incredible emotion that welled up when she was telling us this. So this very emotional response this story generated arose not out of sound alone, but the ways in which her memories, the viscerality of the body, the way we felt as we were walking through this woodland, our discussion about sound, and the engagement with place through non-visual senses all came together in this particular configuration. And this, I think, is the significance of this situated sonic methodology that I've been using. It facilitates accessing such affective and emotional experiences. So prior to our walk through the woods, Olivia spoke about the importance of the woods in ensuring children have skills in self-reliance and self-confidence. And she spoke about the spirituality and artistic creativity of this community. So in these sorts of ideas, we hear a connection to environmental discourse of the 1960s, for example, particularly in this idea of a back to the land ethic. So in this discussion is highlighted her felt connections to place in terms of spirituality rather than a discourse of capacities, resilience or even green politics. But something else unfolds in the practices of listening in situ, something that's only made manifest when Olivia became engaged in what we've called affective listening. So returning to the idea of sound as not merely a means of communication or conscious signification of the presence of particular sounding objects or processes. The point is that we're immersed in sound, but many of the sounds we find ourselves in may not be registered consciously. Yet these sounds may nonetheless have powerful unconscious effects and therefore can't be dismissed as meaningless noise. So rethinking the sonic world in terms of Leibniz's petite perception, Christoph Cox argues that we engage in both conscious and unconscious perceptions of sound, and that each of our conscious perceptions is grounded in a vast swarm of elements that do not reach conscious thought. Leibniz calls these unconscious perceptions a virtual existence, and of significance, memory, he argues, is located here. So while in our everyday lives we may be unaware of this virtuality, we may encounter a sound that triggers access and draws our attention. And this is fundamental to understanding the nature of sound. As Cox points out, sound renders not the world of objects and things that are composed, but rather makes audible the dynamic, differential, discordant flux of becoming. So what I'm suggesting is that attending to sound and listening practices can help to move beyond, beneath or behind representational and discursive registers of thought and reveals more of the unconscious or pre-conscious affective aspects of everyday life. And in this approach, sound provides important clues to the affective and emotional connections and disconnections to place that help sustain both collective and individual understandings of place. It's not simply that we resonate with sonic elements, but that our differential perception of these sonic elements directly affects the ways in which we constitute and inhabit our everyday places. So in exploring these relations between sound, affect and listening, I'm arguing that we can better understand the impact of sound and how it has physiological and psychological impacts, and that this opens up ways to reconsider the processes involved in constituting our relationship between ourselves and others and place, as well as the non-cognitive and unconscious practices of place-making. And that's because a critical exploration of how such tacit, visceral and embodied knowledges are imbued in place, and the significance of these various processes in shaping ideas of connectedness, belonging and home, can tell much about the making of our meaningful places. Thank you.